First of all, welcome everyone, whether you're joining live or watching the recording. Thank you for joining us. My name is Natalie Walker. I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we're a college entrance exam and assessment suite for grades 7 through 12. One thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. 2/3 of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank. This is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we have inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career, and hopefully you'll engage with them throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year, to help our author tonight is one of the best you can read in the springtime, I think, and that's Chaucer. Our college partner tonight is Mount St. Mary's University, which is the oldest independent Catholic university in the United States. Located in the Catoctin Mountains near historic Emmitsburg, Maryland, the university offers more than 80 undergraduate programs, but every mountaineer takes the sequential core curriculum based on the Catholic intellectual tradition and rooted in the liberal arts. St. Mary's students gain a true liberal arts education in all of its dimensions: communication, analytical skills, cultural content, and character formation. They also have a great faculty ratio of 12-1, very intimate learning experience, and we have one of those excellent faculty members with us tonight. Dr. Sean Lewis is an associate professor of English at Mount St. Mary's, where he teaches medieval literature, linguistics, and several of the core humanities courses. Prior to the Mount, he taught at Wyoming Catholic College, University of America, two very good friends of the CLT as well. Dr. Lewis has published on Chaucer, Dante, and medieval literary genres. He is currently working on a study of medievalism in modern and contemporary Catholic discourse. There will be time after the lecture for questions, so keep your questions close and we'll be fielding those from the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you for having me, Natalie. This is quite a pleasure. And yeah, I often ask for prompts when I do something like this, and your prompt was quite general. So if you have questions, if there's something that I don't hit in this lecture, please do that. And I thought that I would break this down in terms of some background in terms of who was Chaucer, right? Kind of bibliographic historical situation, why Chaucer has been important in English literary history. So how he became this big canonical author that is on a reading list like this. A possible problem with that I think is worth addressing, and then spending most of the time focusing on the reasons that I think that Chaucer continues to be important for us to read. Not just that he is on an historical list of big canonical great authors, but why he continues to deserve our attention. So that's the general framework, and please, if I don't address something, ask that at the end. So first off, who was Chaucer? And I will say this, I'll put a plug in for one of the better works of Chaucer scholarship I've seen in the last 5 years. This is Chaucer, A European Life by Marion Turner, came out in 2019. It is a magnificent biography of Chaucer. Turner does such a good job at really bringing 14th century Europe to life and using it as a lens to study his work. So highly recommend Marion's work. But a little distillation of who he was. Geoffrey Chaucer, his dates are from around 1342 to 1400. So he's living in the second half of the 14th century. He's born in London, the son of a wine merchant. So he's growing up in central London. His family, the Chaucers, are part of this growing middle class, right? So they're not nobles by any stretch of the imagination, but they also are decently off, right? And so Geoffrey's father arranges for him to become a page to the court of the Duchess of Ulster. This leads to some service that he undertakes in the 100 Years' War, so fighting on the English side during the 100 Years' War. Pretty early on in his career, he becomes part of the household of John of Gaunt, who's the Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful noblemen in England at the time. One of Gaunt's sons is ultimately going to be Henry IV. So those of you who know Shakespeare, the second tetralogy, yeah, that is that John of Gaunt, that Chaucer spends most of his life as part of his household, which is an interesting concept, right? So being a part of a noble household, it's not just that you're like so you are a domestic servant, but it's not just that, right? You don't get a salary, but you get access to these people who are insanely influential and powerful. And so when Chaucer comes into his own as an adult, he essentially spends most of his career as what we might consider a career bureaucrat. He's given a number of different posts in government, generally in London. He serves as the clerk of the works of London, which oversees the repairing of buildings. He's the wool comptroller at one point, which doesn't sound that impressive, but wool is the biggest export in England at the time. So it's actually a pretty decent role. He serves as an ambassador for the crown on several occasions. He serves on embassies to Navarre in Spain, to France, to the Low Countries, to Milan, to Florence. Clearly has a facility with languages, one that probably went back to his youth. If you're a wine importer in England, no one speaks English at this time, right? You've got to know French and Italian and these languages that you're using to import. He spends some time as a member of parliament. As he's older, then in his last years, he retired to an apartment in Westminster Abbey, where he died and where he's now buried. Now, none of that would indicate that this guy's an author, right? And so something that has long fascinated biographers of Chaucer is his public life is fairly ordinary for sort of an upper middle class civil servant. So where is this literary impulse coming from? That's something that I think that I'll answer in just a second, but he did have this rich life of writing literature in English, right? At the time, Latin, of course, is the most important language internationally in Western Europe as the language of the church, the language of the university, science. Chaucer knows Latin, reads it, and can write it, but he doesn't write literary works in it. French is a prestige literary language. There's some indication that Chaucer may have initially started composing in French, but none of that survives. He very quickly decided English is what he wanted to be writing in. And so perhaps because of this choice, part of how Chaucer becomes important to English literary history, that second tab on this lecture, is that he has this immense popularity immediately following his death. So in the 15th century, you have aspiring poets in the English language looking to him as a model for composition. The Scottish Chaucerian, so away up in Scotland, you have Scottish mockers who are reading Chaucer, circulated in manuscript, mind you, and imitating his style, continuing some of his stories. John Lydgate, a Benedictine monk in England, one of the most prolific authors of the 15th century, is solidly in the Chaucer camp. He even writes a kind of fan fiction addition to the Canterbury Tales. So Chaucer's works generate a lot of popular interest by aspiring authors in the 15th century. And then with the advent of printing, of course, William Caxton brings the printing press from the continent to England, sets himself up in Westminster, and some of the first texts he publishes are works of Geoffrey Chaucer, because again, you already have this literary following of him. This is related to the rise in a new term for the time, vernacular literacy. So for most of the Middle Ages, if you were literate, that meant you can read and write Latin, right? Latinate literacy is the key. In my classrooms, when I introduce something, I have to ask students, like, I say, so how many of you can read and write Latin? Show of hands, right? And, some of them, we do have some Latin students at Mount St. Mary's, but generally speaking, it's like, not really, or none. So, okay, you're all illiterate. And in fact, most of our faculty is illiterate based on this. But then to flip it around, so let's say that you are a wine importer in London. You can read and write in English, French, Dutch, and Italian, right? So you can speak those languages, you can read them, you can write in them. But you're technically illiterate, right? Something odd is happening here. There's a kind of cultural shift where there's this emerging class of people who have literacy in vernacular languages who are looking for reading material, right? Chaucer is providing that. William Caxton, there's a market for this. And so at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, right, the beginning of the Tudor era, Chaucer is a widely published and widely read popular English author. The canonization comes actually during the reign of Henry VIII, right? 1532, the first complete works of Chaucer are published. And in this, Chaucer is framed as, a poet who is linked specifically to a native English literary tradition. He's co-opted as a kind of royal poet because of his association with John of Gaunt, right? So he becomes a kind of symbol of Henrician, Tudor power and authority. in terms of founding a national literary tradition, George Putnam, in his book on English poetry in 1589, refers to Chaucer as the father of English poets, right? So like, again, the 16th century, right? Now we're in the Elizabethan era, right? Like Shakespeare's time. E. Talbot Donaldson has demonstrated pretty well that Shakespeare was a close reader of Chaucer. So that's another way in which these authors are kind of talking to one another. I presume that you have a lecture on Shakespeare, right? Okay, yeah. If not, I'd be happy to talk about it. So Shakespeare's a careful reader of Chaucer. Edmund Spenser, who's essentially Queen Elizabeth I's self-appointed poet, the writer of the Fairy Queen, right? He is self-consciously trying to model himself as a Chaucerian poet, right? Sort of carry on this initial tradition from Chaucer forward. And as recently, I think it was in 2016 or this study, like as recently as that, you mentioned in your gracious introduction that Chaucer is an author that you may study once you hit university. As recently, a study in 2016 showed that if you're studying people like Chaucer your first year or two in university, that's a mark of relatively prestigious and relatively challenging universities and colleges. Right, so Chaucer, I think, still carries this kind of prestige clout based on his historic place at the fountain of the specifically English literary tradition, right? But there's a problem here in terms of his continued canonicity or even his accessibility, and that's the linguistic problem. I'm going to share my screen, if I may, to show you an illustration. So back in the mid-20th century, a kind of rite of passage of English majors was, I'm not that old, by the way, but my professors who were of that generation made me do this because this is a rite of passage as an undergraduate, is to memorize the opening of the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales, right? That's generations have done that. And it's getting back to the sense of Chaucer as a monumental author. I'll show you a problem, though, or a difficulty in terms of access to Chaucer once I share the screen. So I'll take this away. Okay, so, and you can still see this, Natalie? Okay, so going off of hello? Are we still on? There was some weird connectivity problem on my end. I apologize.
Yeah. We were seeing your screen and we were seeing a sort of gray box.
Okay. I apologize for that. Let me try this one more time. Zoom is good for a lot of things like this, but it has its flaws. Let me try that one more time.
Let's see again.
Okay. There we go. I'll hide this. You'll see a little gray box, and then come on. Okay. Do you have a clear shot of the screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so this is the famous opening of the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales from the Riverside edition, which is the big canonical edition of it. And tell me, what might be strange here. Juan that April with his sure resorter, the drocht of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, in spirit had, in every holt and hath, the tender croppus, and the youngest son hath in the ram his half corsirona, and smaller fules maken melodie, that slepen all the night with open ye. So pricketh him nature and her courages. Then longed folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmerers for to seek in straunge strondes, to ferne hallows, coot in sundry Londes, and specially from every shear's ende of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, that him hath holpen when that they were sick. Now, what should be clear here is that even though this is English, this is not modern English, right? Chaucer is writing in Middle English, which is certainly not Old English. This is a correction I always do. Beowulf, that's Old English, like Grendel Gongen, Godus Irabara. So it's totally different Germanic language. This is, particularly if you read enough of it, you get like 85% there with a bit of practice, but there is this kind of linguistic barrier between Chaucer and us that doesn't exist in quite the same way for someone like Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare's language is old, but it's still early modern English. This is Middle English, which has some linguistic features that are quite different from modern English. And you know, so if the idea is the only reason that we read Chaucer is because of his big canonical status, the danger is this becomes a kind of exercise that's done for its own sake, right? You sort of rattle off the Middle English without attending to the utter beauty of the meaning of this passage, right? So the opening of the Canterbury Tales has this cosmic frame, right? To read the interlinear translation and speaking to the prestige or difficulty factor, whichever one you think it is, this is from Harvard's page on Chaucer, right? That has a kind of interlinear translation. And so you've got this like incredible pan in effect, like a cinema. So when April with his sweet smelling showers has pierced the drought of March to the root and bathed every vein of the plants in such liquid by which power the flower is created, when the west wind also with his sweet breath in every wooden field has breathed life into the tender new leaves, and the young sun has run half his course in Aries. So all these astronomical and natural phenomena, and small fowls, small birds make melody, those that sleep all night with open eyes, so nature incites them in their hearts. Then folk long to go on pilgrimages, right? So it's like you've got all of and April, right? This month, right? Spring is bursting out all over, right? Depending on when Easter falls, it's either toward the end of Lent or you're in Eastertide, it's a time of celebration, a time to go on pilgrimages. Like everything in creation and nature and astronomy is impelling us humans to go on pilgrimages, right? And palmers for to seek strange shores, to distant shrines known in various lands, and specially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr who helped them when they were sick. So I'll stop that just to go back here on two accounts, right? So if you're having difficulty with the Middle English, I'm not a purist on this, right? Start to read Chaucer in a decent translation, particularly one with facing pages or with alternating lines, because as you'll see, the language isn't that different, right? Shoe risolta as opposed to shower sweet, right? If you read a little more, you get used to it and you rely less and less on the translation. But moving beyond considering Chaucer as just important as one of these like big traditional authors since the age of Henry VIII, I think that Chaucer continues to be important to read, even given that kind of linguistic difficulty. Now, of course, as someone who teaches historical linguistics, it's also quite nice to consider Chaucer as a representative of this part of the evolution of the English language, right? Going from Old English to early Middle English to Chaucer's Middle English, and then slipping into early modern English, which leads us to modern English. English doesn't really become modern until around 1800. So in terms of linguistic history, it's still interesting. But if you want something more literary and humanistic and philosophical in its direction, which I think y'all do, I think that it's important to kind of step away from the kind of history of Chaucer's canonization and reception, right? Like if forget for a moment that he is the father of English literature who's in every anthology and collection for hundreds of years, right? If you forget that and just consider his works with a fresh set of eyes, you see a few things, I think. First off, in terms of just a British literature survey, like why might you want to read Chaucer in a survey of British literature? He is the first English author to write in a wide variety of genres, right? So he writes dream visions, which are very popular from a poem at the time, shorter lyrics, complaints, which is a technical poetic genre, tragedy. His Troilus and Cressida is probably his most popular work immediately after his death. It's like gorgeously, achingly tragic story set within the Trojan War. It was the inspiration for Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, and Helen Cooper, who's the C.S. Lewis Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature at Cambridge. I had the amazing good fortune of studying under her at one point, and like in her words, like it's just so sad. It's such a, like, it's hard to read more than once. It's a masterpiece of tragedy, which is particularly interesting given Chaucer's deep Christian commitment, right? In fact, situating this in literary history, Christian authors in the Middle Ages articulate a problem of, like, how do you write a tragedy? Right? Like we know that tragedies existed in the classical world, and they're like these important genres. But if you're a Christian, right, death is already conquered, the victory's already won, right? Christ is risen, hallelujah. How do you write a tragedy? And Chaucer does, partly by situating it within pagan antiquity, right? So like you set a story within the Trojan War, suddenly you're dealing with pagan characters who don't realize that, right? So Chaucer, as a Christian author talking to a Christian audience, is able to imagine tragedy by making that kind of leap towards a kind of historical fiction. But I can go say more about that if you want the question and answer. But getting back to this, so he writes in all those literary genres, but also philosophy. He translates Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into Middle English. Religion, he translates confessional manuals, pious religious prayers. He writes religious prayers. And science. The first scientific text in English is his treatise on the astrolabe, which he wrote for his son Lewis, who was a student at Oxford. Like, here's how you'd use this. It's an astronomical tool, right? So in terms of British literature survey, that's the thing that if you forget that he's big and canonical, that really jumps out. This is a guy who writes well, right? Has a facility for writing vividly in a bunch of different genres across disciplines. More importantly, however, I think is considering Chaucer as a pairing with Dante, right? Presumably in the series, you have something on Dante's Commedia, right? The Divine Comedy. If you don't, bring me back and I'd be happy to talk about that. I actually offered a course once, like, on Dante and Chaucer, right? And the notion here is that Chaucer read Dante. He read Dante closely. References to Dante are throughout his works. He clearly had a deep admiration for Dante and his achievement. But whereas Dante focused on this divine comedy, right, going through hell and purgatory and up to heaven and the beatific vision, Chaucer's focus is on the human comedy, right? The Canterbury Tales is his most well-known work. And he deals with the full range of human life and experience in a really profound way, right? One of his earliest works, The Book of the Duchess, is this really poignant portrait of love, loss, and grief, right? Of loving someone and then dealing with their loss. He writes very humorously about courtship in the Parliament of Fowls. That's in that text, we have the first reference to Valentine's Day in the English canon. So thanks, Chaucer. You have models of virtue in The Legend of Good Women, philosophical speculation on the nature of language in The House of Fame. As I said, there's this immense joy and immense sorrow in Troilus and Cressida, and the goodness and oddity of human life itself in the Canterbury Tales. So I think that Chaucer's works continue to shed light on perennial human realities, right? As long as human beings, love and hate, as long as human beings, strive to be better, strive to know the world. Chaucer's a model of somebody who's doing that, thinking through that through story in a really profound way. Chaucer did not claim a divine vision, right? He's not claiming that he's speaking from divine inspiration here, a dream like Dante. His vision is what humanity actually is. And he approached that humanity with a humaneness that I greatly admire. Again, focusing on his best known work, the Canterbury Tales. If in a reading list of classic texts you see Chaucer, it's almost always going to be selections from the Canterbury Tales, right? This is his last work. It's incomplete. He dies before it's finished, though he does give it, I think, a finished form. It is finished in a sense, right? He does give it an ending before he dies. But in the Canterbury Tales, we find this really colorful cast of characters from all walks of life, right? From high status to low status, all over the moral spectrum as well. And they're all going on pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket in Canterbury, okay? As we saw in the general prologue. So this literal prologue, these pilgrims telling stories to pass the time as they ride from London to Canterbury, is a really thin allegory for the pilgrimage of life itself. Right? As we live our lives, we find ourselves in the midst of a few truly good people, a few really bad ones, and most of us are somewhere in between, right? Humans are imperfect. We fail. And that's all right, I think, for Chaucer's poetic vision, since we can always reorder those relationships with one another and with God through things like shared dialogue, prayer, and recognizing that we are companions on this journey from this life to the next. Right. So Chaucer's, even though the Canterbury Tales is grounded in a very kind of earthy, even body kind of tale-telling contest, the theological frame is quite profound when you start getting down into it. I think that Chaucer's Christian humanism also provides a much needed lesson for us, right? Now, Chaucer is not uncritical of evils that he sees in the state and in the church, right? In the Clark's Tale, for example, we find a portrait of Walter, this Italian nobleman who's utterly tyrannical. He keeps testing the virtue of his wife Griselda, just seeing how far she like when will I get her to break, right? In a really inhumane fashion. I mean, to the extent of pretending to murder their two children and divorcing her and casting her into poverty, right? But she's still good and patient, and that's supposed to be, again, it's monstrous, right? And I think there's a lot going on there, but Chaucer had firsthand experience with tyranny while he was on embassy in Milan, right? That the Sforza dukes like had a real like civic power push to to emphasize their autocratic power. An example that Turner has from her book is in this church they patronize, like the statue of the Duke is like front and center and over the altar. It's like, oh my gosh, right? Like imagine any political figure putting their face over the altar of a church. It doesn't look good, right? That there's something wrong going on in terms of the assertion of political dictatorship there. Chaucer saw the popular revolts in England in the 1380s, which often were a result of nobility taking advantage of the poor, right? There was a lot of social and economic unrest in Chaucer's time as well. In the Parliament of Fowls, he uses the word election for the first recorded time in English to mean this process of nominating a candidate for Parliament. Right. And there does seem to be an interest in Chaucer's whole literary production on the kind of the multiple voices of the people. Right. He clearly is not a Democrat. Right. He's in service to the crown his entire life. But he does have that sensitivity to, but the people's voice also is something that needs to be considered here. Right. And to the extent that the powers that be are not listening or attending to them, that's a problem that needs to be called out. And then, of course, in religion, if you look at the Canterbury Tales, the monk, the friar, and especially the pardoner are some of the baddies in the Canterbury Tales, right? Some really shady, morally suspicious characters. These were used, by the way, in the 16th century to cast Chaucer as a kind of proto-Protestant. Right. I mean, so part of the problem, so Chaucer's being your national poet, your father of English literature, and now you're a Protestant nation, that could become a little embarrassing, right? Because he lived before the Reformation, but they go, oh, well, he made fun of this friar, so he was a good, strong Protestant like us. Later scholars show, no, there's no indication he was anything other than a typical English Catholic of his time. But he's an English Catholic with a brain who knows there are a lot of bad things going on, abuses within the church, right? And he's not afraid to call that out, as well as provide his character of the parson, simple parish priest who is by far the most virtuous and moral character in the Canterbury Tales, right? Someone who serves the poor and the weak of his parish in defiance of temptations to wealth and power, right? So I think that what makes the social and religious critique utterly Chaucerian is the gentleness with which it's done, right? Particularly in America, we have this long tradition of critiquing abuses in power, right? Chaucer does it so lovingly, though, right? That's something that we don't tend to do, right? The Canterbury Tales is maybe the first work of literature to portray really complex individuals, not just stereotypes, right? And to the extent that, particularly in the era of social media, it's so easy to stereotype others, right? To box in people, particularly the ones that we don't agree with, right? To reduce them to like this position or that position, rather than recognizing they are complex human beings like ourselves. I don't think Chaucer ever loses that vision, even when he's showing problematic elements of his world, right? Take the pardoner, for example. So the pardoner, a pardoner sold papal indulgences. If you're at all familiar with the Reformation, you know what's coming with that, right? And not just a seller of indulgences, he is a totally mercenary character. He has a side business of selling relics that he knows are fake. He makes them himself, and he has nothing but contempt for these gullible believers. He even says that he doesn't care if these people go to hell. He just wants their money. Like that is about as shockingly negative a character that you can get, right? But the story he tells is actually a fairly solid, edifying moral tale about the vice of greed, right? It's like Chaucer has this interesting vision where even this self-professed really bad guy can still have a story, can still tell a story that somehow edifies, right? That there's something like what he preaches is different from what he practices, but that doesn't necessarily negate the good of what he preaches. It's really complex there. Also, you know, more recent scholarship, just classroom discussion on him shows that Chaucer does provide some details that actually make you sort of sympathize with the partner in some ways. He has some kind of disability. In contemporary scholarship, that's an interesting factor, right? He's disabled in some way, not normal as opposed to the other characters. He's bullied by another pilgrim. He doesn't really want to do this, but he's sort of like forced into the storytelling contest. So those sorts of things that maybe you need to recontextualize what he's saying, right? Like if you have this guy with a disability who's forced to tell a story, then part of his, well, yeah, I don't care about y'all, you can go to hell. It's like that, that at least arguably makes it more complicated, right? Maybe he's not as evil as he presents himself. It's more something in the situation, right? That Chaucer allows you to give yourself the benefit of the doubt there, right? And where was I there? Yeah. And it's important to remember too that, like, again, in the depiction of the problematic parts of the church, like this pardoner, you also have the parson, right? And so I said that the Canterbury Tales is unfinished as it is, and that's true, right? The storytelling contest rules are, so Harry Bailey, the owner of this inn in London, says, okay, here are the rules. So everyone is going to tell a tale going to Canterbury. We'll then have our little pictures of Canterbury. We'll tell a tale on the way back. And then whoever tells the best tale wins a free meal at the rest of the party's expense at my inn, right? So food is also an conviviality here. They never get to Canterbury. That as the sun is setting, right? They stop for the night at this town that you can see Canterbury from, right? They're not far, but the sun is setting, right? The day is ending, and the host calls for one more story before they sleep, and it's the parson, right? This parish priest who says, look, I'm not a good storyteller, right? I'm not a good poet. So what I'm going to tell you is essentially how to make a good confession. And it's this law, it's a Dominican penitential manual that Chaucer translated into English. That's just how you recognize what evil is, how you turn from evil. So it's this, the end of the Canterbury Tales as it stands. It's not what was envisioned from the general prologue, but it turns the focus back on the self, right? In terms of who am I, how am I failing, and how can I rectify that? And it's that call out evil in the world, but we're part of that world, and recognizing ourselves as part of those systems of evil is something that I think is inherently Chaucerian, and what gives his comedy such a light touch, right? He's not spewing invective on evil. He's saying, yeah, this is bad. This is so bad, it's funny, right? Well, let's mock this and recognize that we're part of this too. So again, for that kind of comic vision, I think that's definitely a reason to keep him on this reading list, keep him in this canon, because he provides such a unique perspective on those complex human phenomena. I think this attitude is also shown in his treatment of other marginalized people, particularly women characters. I mentioned the Legend of Good Women earlier. So the Legend of Good Women is it's right there in the title, right? It's a series of good women. Like in the prologue, Geoffrey casts himself as a character, which he does a lot. I'll get to that in a second. But like Geoffrey falls asleep, he wakes up, and the god of love comes there and says, "You've written poorly about women, and now I'm going to punish you." And then this virtuous woman, Alceste, says, "No, it's not his fault. Just have him write stories about good women." And so it's all this list of it's almost like saints' lives of women from mythology and classical antiquity who are these like models of virtue, right? And this is something that lots of criticism knows, that Chaucer seems to have a particular attention to women and their voices and their experiences throughout his canon. The most famous woman, of course, is Alison, the wife of Bath, right? The wife of Bath's prologue and tale is highly anthologized, highly assigned. And like the pardoner, I mean, not quite as evil, right? She doesn't wish anyone go to hell, right? But she's also complex, right? She was married off to an old man when she was 12 years old. Right. That's now, of course, people got married younger than 12 is still creepily young for the 14th century. Right. And married for money. And since then, she's had 5 husbands. Right. So not at the same time, in succession. And she's clearly been judged for this. Right. This was an open question in medieval Christendom at the time. Right. If your spouse dies, is it licit to remarry? And there are different theological opinions on that. And some people in the party clearly are scandalized by the fact that she had 5 husbands. Right. But she's unapologetically herself. She knows the Bible in and out and gives all these biblical reasons for why this is okay, right? She cites classical literature. She's clearly well-read. She's a highly successful businesswoman, right? One of the things that marrying rich old men does in her case is provide her with a lot of money as well as independence to start her own business. She going back to Chaucer's involved in the wool trade. She makes wool, and her wool is some of the best in Europe. She's incredibly wealthy, incredibly successful, and the success allows her to go on pilgrimage, right? So it's like she's wealthy, she's successful, and she's pious, maybe? She also loves sexual intercourse. She is unapologetically sex positive, and advises wives to use sex to control their husbands to get what they want. So what is she? Is she a villain? Is she a hero? She's human, right? She's something in the middle. And I think that she's continued to garner such critical attention because she is so complicated. Helen Cooper, again, has demonstrated that she had such a long afterlife. Like she really captured the imagination of Chaucer's readers, generations of Chaucer's readers, up to this day. You will always get a debate in a literature classroom if you teach the wife of Bath's prologue and tale. So again, there's this really lively character who is allowed to have her own voice. Again, getting back to Chaucer's interest in the polyphony of voices in the human world, right? Not one dominating another, but rather, to use a musical image, right? This polyphony. In fact, and here I'm drawing to an end, and I see it, the time I think is going to work out nicely. I think that if you recontextualize Chaucer, right, he's less of a canonical giant and more of an avant-garde experimental writer. Right, you've got this monumental, like his tomb in Westminster, right? If any of you go to Westminster Abbey, right, he's buried in the transept. Edmund Spenser, again, Elizabeth I's propagandistic poet who writes the Faerie Queen, right? He has himself buried next to Chaucer, right? That's a clear power move, right? And that's what is the beginning of the Poets' Corner. So if you go there now, there are some poets that are buried near Chaucer, but most major English literary authors have a plaque or some monument near it, right? This national monument to our national English literature. And at the center of that is the tomb of Geoffrey Chaucer, right? That can obscure the fact that he was really experimental, right? As I said, he did not write in either of the 2 languages you thought he would, Latin or French. He ended up focusing on everyday humans and the stories that amused them. And something that I've already alluded to, he inserted himself as a character in his works again and again and again, right? This is something that he keeps coming back to. He is one of the Canterbury Pilgrims, and his self-portrait there, as in other works, is not complimentary at all. He's utterly self-deprecating in terms of presenting himself as this awkward, clueless little guy who's really bad at telling stories. Chaucer the Pilgrim is forced to tell a story, and he tells the tale of Sir Topas, which is a metrical romance. It's like a chivalric romance, knightly story that goes nowhere. There's like no plot. The rhyme is annoyingly sing-songy. So much of the host says, "Stop, no more, enough of this. This is hurting my ears." Like the fictional host is telling Chaucer, "Shut up, you're really bad at this." And I love that, right? I mean, this is a level of metafiction that my students most often associate with like modern novels or postmodern film. No, it's right there in Chaucer, right? The postmodern is the medieval and vice versa. Again, I think that kind of self-deprecating humor is part of what I love about Chaucer's poetic vision, right? But also, he writes in verse. He does have some prose works, but the majority of his stuff is in rhymed English lyric. And though he's writing in poetry, I think that because of all of this, he's a very important antecedent to the modern novel, right? Some of the features that you see in like Cervantes' Don Quixote is commonly pointed to as like one of the first big modern novels. A lot of the features that he has there, you're already seeing in Chaucer, right? A couple hundred years before, though again, in poetry and poetic narrative text. So I think that Chaucer ultimately is a great author because he does what all great authors do. He represents some part of the truth and beauty and goodness and falsity and ugliness and evil that make up our imperfect human experience. And he does it with a good humor and a Christian hope that I think makes these imperfections unproblematic at the end, right? That's not a problem that this world is so unstable, right? And I'd like to end, and then some time for questions, with one of his poems I think illustrates this. This is Lack of Steadfastness. It's a ballad that's addressed to King Richard II. Most of his life he served under Richard II. And even without a gloss, I think we'll be able to appreciate this. Sometime the world was so steadfast and stable that man's word was obligation. And now it is so false and deceivable that word and deed as in conclusion they nothing like. For turned up so doon is all this world for maid and wilfulness, that all is lost for lack of steadfastness. What maketh this world to be so variable, but lust that folk have in dissension? For among us now a man is hold unable, but if he can be some collusion done his neighbour wrong or oppression. What causeth this but wilful wretchedness, that all is lost for lack of steadfastness? Truth is put down, reason is holden fable, virtue hath now no domination, piété exiled, no man is merciable. For covetous is blent discretion, the world hath made a permutation, fro richt to wrong, fro truth to fickleness, that all is lost for lack of steadfastness. Then he addresses King Richard, O Prince, desire to be honorable, cherish thy folk, and hate extortion. Suffer nothing that may be reprobable to the state, done in the region. Show forth the sword of castigation. Dread God, do law, love truth and worthiness, and wed the folk again to steadfastness. And I'll end on that Chaucerian note.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to hear you read, Chaucer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fantastic. So anyone is welcome to put questions in the chat, but I will certainly start with my own. So many. Let's start with maybe the prologue. If a student is reading this book for the first time, it's their first time encountering the prologue, it's a good month. Do you have any sort of suggested, any questions that you would ask them as they read?
Yeah, so again, there's this like cosmic zoom in, right? Showing that like our human lives and the rhythms of life are part of this larger cosmic order. But it goes very quickly to the particular and the human. And so if you're reading the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales for the first time, pay attention to the cast of characters, right? Because Geoffrey the Pilgrim is sort of there in the Tabard Inn, and he's meeting all these pilgrims who are going to go. So it's not like, yeah, if you go on a pilgrimage in this day and age, you've got a travel agency or a youth group or somebody's organizing it. It wasn't like that. It's just like an inn. Also, what Marion Turner has shown, like an inn is a very special classification where you have like these really upscale quarters for the wealthy, but also like really cheap bunks for people who are poorer, right? So it's a really good cross section of society would be at an inn in Southwark, the South Bank of London, and so. These people are just sort of there at the inn. They've spent the night, or they're having some food, and they all just realize they're all going on pilgrimage, right? They all want to go to pilgrimage. So it's kind of this loose group of people who are traveling together, partly for safety, right? Even though by the 14th century things were a bit better, you still got robbers on the roads, or say safety in numbers, things like that. And so the first thing to notice is just how these people are characterized. So the details. When I taught this at Wyoming Catholic College, in our medieval literature survey, one of the students said something that has stuck with me ever since, saying that like this is the first time in my literature classes here at Wyoming Catholic College I think I've encountered an individual, right? Like when you're the prioress, right? So she's the head of a convent of nuns, right? She's not just like a stock prioress. She's got all this individuality as well, right? Again, I think that that's part of Chaucer's art. He's one of the first people to really focus on this. But something you might want to do is see, like, are you more positively or negatively inclined to these characters, and why? Right. And some of them are clearly more shady than others, but they're all tossed together. And again, the narrative frame of the story, the host of the inn proposes this game, right? And the rules of the game are the person who wins who tells the tale of best sentence and most solace, right? So that is, say, the best like moral to the story and the most enjoyable story. So you've got on the one hand instruction and enjoyment. Yeah, and this is going back to Horace, right? The purpose of poetry is to instruct and delight. But like, so that can be fun as you read it yourself or with a class to think about, well, like who would win on those this criteria. The past couple of times I've taught the Canterbury Tales at Mount St. Mary's, I've had this as part of a final exam question. And it really tickles me because the last 2 times I did it, I got a different answer from every single student, right? But that also points to appreciating medieval literature the way it was supposed to be appreciated, namely in a communal setting, right? And this is solidly established, right? That while literacy rates were much lower in the Middle Ages than they are now, even taking into account this sort of vernacular literacy that's growing, reading was always done in public. So like if you're at a tavern, right? If most of the people in the tavern can't read a single word, but you have a book and you start reading to them, suddenly you've got a whole community of people enjoying that story and discussing it, right? That's another thing. In medieval literature, like the end of the first part of the Knight's Tale. The Knight's Tale, the first tale of Canterbury Tales, often excerpted, a tale of chivalric romance. At the end of the Knight's Tale, the first part of the Knight's Tale, he asks the audience a direct question, right? So which of these 2 knights had it worse off? And it's like he's inviting you to answer, right? So this is a very audience participatory kind of thing. So I'll end my statement in a second to get onto more questions. But what I'd say is, so you read the general prologue, you form like this initial picture of the character. Then a really interesting exercise is, once you're reading their story, to what extent is their prologue and their story meeting your expectations or overturning them? Right? Because in some cases, it's pretty clearly, okay, yeah, that's the kind of story that I thought the knight would tell based on his description. But some of them don't fit quite as well, right? And as I indicated in the Pardoner's Tale, that's perhaps one of the most clear instances of the tale itself being a very different kind of moral universe than the teller who's telling it, right? And so these questions of authorship, authority, and the morality of fiction, particularly if told by a really bad guy. I mean, these are all questions that Chaucer is dealing with. And I think that those simple things of how is he characterizing them, and how does their character match or not match their tale, that's a great way for just initially understanding the Canterbury Tales.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's great advice for approaching this book. You mentioned sort of offhandedly in the lecture that pilgrimage is a great kind of metaphor, I guess, for life in general. So just beginning, going somewhere, ending, I suppose. I was wondering, I wanted to invite you to kind of, what are some kind of next steps a reader could take with that as they think about the Canterbury Tales? Maybe specifically, where does that situate storytelling in life?
I mean, it's interesting because again, my mind then goes to, well, it is also interesting to read pilgrim accounts from the period as well, right? Because this is a very popular practice, very important to Western, well, and even Eastern Christian spirituality. But let me answer it this way and then see if it's sufficient. That the phenomenon of pilgrimage, I think, gets at the complexity of human motivations. And this is what I mean, that when you think pilgrimage, particularly in our day, you think, oh, you see holy, pious, right? Like, why in the world would you want to go on pilgrimage? Because you're already some sort of good Christian who's doing this out of pious duties. In the Middle Ages, that wasn't always the case, because one, pilgrimages were often assigned as a form of penance, right? The knight, for instance, he's fought in wars all over the continent, and you learn in the general prologue that he's like just come from one of these. And one way of reading the knight on pilgrimage is that it's a common practice, right? Like, even if that war was justified, etc., you're still killing people, right? And I think that maybe the medieval imagination had a better sense of the complexity of that than what we get in the modern age. That even if this is the most justified war possible, you're still killing other human beings. And so, like, having a way like reintegrating yourself into society by first going on pilgrimage, do this religious ritual. Yeah, that's complicated. Also, as with what are some of the major pilgrimage locations to this day? You've got Jerusalem, right? You've got Rome. If you think about pilgrimage in a broader sense, I've taken students from Mount St. Mary's on study abroad trips over spring break to London, to Paris, right? Always great fun, far too little time, but you can do it within the middle of a semester without having to take a whole semester abroad. But to think about pilgrimage as, being very mindful of the experience you're having. Right? I think that even in a secular sense, we do go on pilgrimages, right? To go, let's say, if you go to a spot intentionally open to new experiences, rather than the sort of typical checklist of what I need to see as a tourist. I think there's a kind of secularized form of pilgrimage that still really speaks to us today. And getting back to that complexity, in the Middle Ages, it was both and, right? It's something that you do religiously, maybe because you're pious, maybe because you're not so pious, but it's also fun, right? You're riding with other people, you're telling stories, you're going to see the sights when you're there. And again, I think getting back to what I appreciate about Chaucer, he certainly has a moral compass, right? And he's a deeply ethical thinker, but he's also highly conscious of the complexity of humans, right? Am I going to Rome because I'm a good devout Catholic, or because I want to have fun? If I'm honest, it's yes, right? It's both and, right? So in terms of the pilgrimage frame, that's where I'd go to some other considerations. And then considering, like, if you take that life as pilgrimage metaphor, which is a common one by the end of the Middle Ages. Oh my goodness, in Dante, what's the first line of Inferno? Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, right? In the middle of the pilgrimage of our life, right? There's a pilgrimage, the first line of Inferno, right? So there's a common image in the Middle Ages, but like, yeah, regardless of your philosophical or religious beliefs, what changes if you see life as a pilgrimage, right? You're sort of making a journey. You're only stopping through this life. You're going to something else, something different, right? That has to reorient your values in various ways. Not that that's the only or maybe even the best metaphor for human life, but that's the one that Chaucer and Dante are using. I think that they speak volumes in terms of a kind of perennial wisdom for how we should live, right? That the here and the now is important. It's good. The here and the now is good. It's important, but it's not everything for them. Anyway, was that sufficient, or?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I just wanted to see the direction you went with it. Yeah, this is fantastic. I'm so excited after this hour to go and read Chaucer again at some point.
That's all I wanted to hear. Yeah.
Shakespeare's Richard II, which is my favorite play. I had never connected the dots before, that he inserts a lot of pilgrimage language into that play, and has Bolingbroke going on a pilgrimage actually at the end.
Yeah, and of course Chaucer, yeah, and Shakespeare would have known, because he almost certainly read Stowe's 1561 edition of the complete works of Geoffrey Chaucer, for reasons that are too pedantic to get into now. That in the introduction, they make so much of the fact that he served under Richard II, right?
Right.
Ah, that's awesome. I hadn't even thought of that connection, but beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. Well, I think you've captured so beautifully just how what a joyful read the Canterbury Tales is, the life affirming, humanity affirming aspect of of the Canterbury Tales. Since we just have a few minutes left,
Mhm.
what's your favorite thing about Mount St. Mary's University and teaching there?
Hey, m- my favorite thing about teaching at Mount St. Mary's, honestly, it's the students, right? It's all about the students, always has to be about the students. And as I think that I've communicated, I take great joy in introducing these texts to students, these ideas, and really forming them as independent thinkers and scholars in their own right. The curriculum is what drew me to Mount St. Mary's, honestly. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Dallas, which y'all probably know if you're part of this project. And so, like the University of Dallas, there's a similarity in terms of it having this common integrated core curriculum that everyone takes regardless of major. But then, unlike Wyoming Catholic College, which is more like St. John's College in Annapolis or TAC in California, there are majors, right? And so what I found in terms of the curriculum is that there's a real advantage to having both, right? That you have this kind of common formation, this foundation in common texts and ideas that allow you to talk to one another and form these friendships across schools and disciplines. But then you have this exciting phenomenon that I experience as an undergraduate, that I see my students experiencing, where, okay, it's like I'm an English major. My roommate is a physics major. The guy across the hall is a biology major who's rooming with a theology major. We all have the same common formation, then we all talk to one another, right? So it's like that more specialized study, I think, does two things. One, it inculcates a kind of Chaucerian humility, right? You know, okay, so I've taken all these advanced courses in my field, and I know now that I'm only scratching the surface, right? So it gives you a kind of better sense of the limits of your own knowledge, right? As well as growing that knowledge in a community with others, where I can say, okay, I'm not an expert on biology, but I've taken some basic stuff. Could you teach me more about this? And so you become more of a community of learners, I think, by both having the common integrated formation as well as those major tracks, if done in the kind of community that we have. I'll also say that the Catholic identity of Mount St. Mary's, I found very fruitful. It's highly mission oriented. It's unapologetically Catholic, and yet very welcoming of people from all or no faith tradition. And that's something that I particularly appreciate, right? That you can have real discussion about matters of religion and philosophy with people who really disagree with one another, but disagree with one another as like friends who are part of the same community. I'm sure that you see this at a lot of the other colleges and universities that you have as part of this, but I've been very impressed with that, right? Of having this unapologetic Catholic identity that's really welcoming of those from outside of our tradition as well.
Mhm. That's so wonderful. Um, we had a question in Q&A. So if you don't mind going 1 minute over, I'd like to
Not at
ask.
all.
Great. Sylvia is asking uh, for homeschool students, high school
Mhm.
students specifically. They have so much, there's so much to read before going to college, so much possibility. Do you have any suggestions of a principle or a couple principles one could follow in making those choices? Must
Hmm.
read before college.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to say two things. So thank you. First off, yeah, Sylvia, thanks so much for the question. It's a very thoughtful one. And I'm going to say something that may sound contradictory, but it's not, right? I think that two common principles are, one, I do think there is a real place for the old established canonical texts, right? So you, like back in the 50s, Mortimer Adler popularized like the great books of Western civilization, right? And there are, some of them are not the best translations. There are questions or problems surrounding the method of selection, who gets in, who gets out. But in general, if you're talking about, you know, the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey, you know, the dialogues of Plato, right? These are the sorts of things that thinkers in the Western tradition have been referring to ever since, right? And I'll add to that Eastern classics as well, right? So Confucius, Mencius, Lao Tzu, right? There's this whole tradition, like in both Eastern and Western philosophy and literature, that like I'm putting my cards on the table. I'm a big believer in the classics, right? And so if you have a choice, reading those classic texts, these are the sorts of things that thinkers and writers have continued to respond to throughout the tradition, right? And so having some sort of facility or familiarity with that, I think is very useful coming into a college or university. Many introductory courses at colleges or universities sort of go over these texts again. I wouldn't see that as a disadvantage in that if you know, T.S. Eliot said, great books can never be read. They can only be reread, right? So if you have this like high school sort of general idea of the Homeric Iliad, now you're studying it in more depth at a college level course, you're going to get so much more out of it. Also, I would encourage you to read highly contemporary works, right? So sort of like hitting both ends of the spectrum. At the end of the day, like if something interests you, read it, right? That's another thing. Sort of like the Inklings, right? C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. They had a very erotic principle of reading, which was desire, right? Like your desires for good things lead you to good things. So if you see a book that looks interesting, read it. But that said, in terms of thinking ahead to college and university, I think the classics are important, but also works have been published in the last 5-10 years, right? That have garnered a lot of critical attention in terms of book reviews. Oh gosh, I will. I like the Booker Prize. The Booker Prize is one of the most prestigious prizes in English literature. And a few years ago, George Saunders won it for his novel called Lincoln in the Bardo. Lincoln in the Bardo is an amazing book. I mean, it is historical fiction. It's like speculative religion and philosophy. It's gorgeous. It has this amazing meditation on loss and sorrow, but also joy. It's so again, like Lincoln in the Bardo is this state of existence after death in Tibetan Buddhism. So that already is kind of weird, right? So Abraham Lincoln somehow being in this Bardo state in Buddhism when he wasn't a Buddhist. But it's really cool, right? And it shows something that, oftentimes we polarize thought between like the religious or the secular, or like modernity is so secularized, but some of our best literary authors have deep interest in religion and spirituality, right? So that kind of undercutting those kind of dichotomous ways of thinking, I hope that answered it. Short answer: read what looks good, but the big canonical classics are good as well as the hot new things. So
yeah, very helpful. Couldn't agree more. I wish I could just keep asking you about books, and especially Chaucer.
thank you.
For the hour. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lewis. This has been really wonderful.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Wonderful. And if you want me to talk about anything else, just let me know, because I've enjoyed this quite a bit.
Great. I will do that. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining. Bye.
All right. Good night.